Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm Gwyneth Mallon. I'm the director of the NYU Center for the Humanities, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all this evening on behalf of our center, our staff, our faculty director, Uli Baer. I want to thank Caroline Osi and Denny Valentin and Soraya Bunker for their help with tonight's event. I also want to thank Aviva Crystal and the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute, Yale University Press, and SUNY Press for their contributions to this event. Tonight we'll be talking about and thinking about when modern men became feminists through a panel discussion of men's engagement with women's rights from the early 20th century to today. Part of this story is, of course, about women's suffrage, and we are celebrating the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. Women in New York State got the vote in 1917, before the 1920 ratification of the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote. So this is a timely and important conversation, especially given that today is Election Day, so we hope that everybody got to the polls before coming here this evening. When we learned at the center about Brooke Kroger's new book, The Suffragettes, How Women Used Men to Get the Vote, we wanted to feature this book as an event. In this book, Brooke explores how some of New York's most powerful men formed the Men's League for Women's Suffrage, which began in 1908 with 150 members and blossomed into a large national organization by 1917. She reclaims this word, suffragettes, a British term by which men who supported women's rights to vote were disdainfully called. Brooke shows that these men helped to inspire a dramatic tonal shift in how politicians, government officials, and male voting public responded to the larger suffrage movement. She looks at what these men did at the behest of this movement and of the movement's female leadership and why. And she looks at this balance of power between prominent men and women who directed them. We want to celebrate Brooke's book tonight, but we also want to have a larger conversation about men and feminism and women's rights. And we're thrilled that this evening we'll be able to hear from Brooke, but also from Gail Collins from the New York Times about her book, America's Women, 400 Years of Dolls, Drudges, Helpmates, and Heroines, and Christoph Irmscher about his book, Max Eastman, A Life. All three of these books are on sale, as you've noticed, both before the event and after the event. So please help yourself to purchasing a book, and I'm sure the authors will be happy to sign them for you. For our program tonight, each author will say a few words about their work, and then Gail Collins will moderate the conversation and make sure that we have time for question and answer period with the audience. I'm going to very briefly introduce the speakers and then turn the evening over to Gail. Gail Collins joined the New York Times in 1995 as a member of the editorial board and later as an op-ed columnist. In 2001, she was appointed the editorial page editor, the first woman ever to hold that post at the Times. Can we have a round of applause, please? Thank you. She's the author of America's Women, here she is, and 4 other books, As Texas Goes, Scorpion Tongues, the Millennium Books, which she wrote with Dan Collins. She's currently at work on a history of older women in America. Christoph Irmscher, let's have a round of applause for him. Bring him on stage. Has taught at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, Harvard University, and the University of Maryland. Since 2006, he's been at Indiana University of Bloomington, where he's Provost Professor of English and the George F. Getz Professor in the Wells Scholars Program. His newest biography is the one we're featuring tonight, Max Eastman, A Life, and that's from Yale University Press. And last but not least, Brooke Kroger. She directs NYU's Journalism Graduate Global and Joint Program and has been a faculty member since 1998. I know a lot of her students are here this evening. She was department chair from 2005 to 2011, and she was the inaugural director here. Her latest book we're celebrating tonight, and she's also the author of several other books, including Undercover Reporting, Passing When People Can't Be Who They Are, and Fanny, The Talent of Success of Fanny Hurst, and then, of course, one of my favorites, Nellie Bly, Daredevil Reporter and Feminist. Please welcome Brooke Crozier.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming out on this dreadful night. That was really great of you all. So I'm going to just talk for a second to say I hope you voted, and that without doubt, the women's vote of 100 years ago, and I think we could count today as an anniversary because, of course, the vote took place on a Tuesday, even though November 6th was the date, so really it was yesterday. But without doubt, this was a woman's achievement. I want to be very clear about that. It was the victorious culmination of 7 decades of struggling for enfranchisement. But yet, in that last determinative decade, from around 1907-08 to 1918-19, for the first and only time we know of in history, men really stepped up for a woman's cause. This was a very significant offer, because then, as now, men controlled the legislatures, men were almost all of the voters, men controlled the media and all the other centers of influence and power. And in a way that we really haven't seen before or since, this brief shining moment, as an organized force, they stepped up. So what I've done is regestalted quickly and just really mere highlights of what these men did. First, a little 90-second overview, and then I've taken them by profession to give you a glimpse of the kinds of arguments they brought to the discussion in that last decade, as men influencing other men, influencing their peers, and influencing women. So here we go.
The Suffragettes tells the story of the prominent, powerful New York men who became a league of their own to help women win the vote. In 1909, 150 of them from the worlds of industry, finance, science, medicine, the courts, the clergy, and the colleges became charter members of the Men's League for Women's Suffrage. Within 3 years, their ranks had grown to include a force of thousands across the country and well beyond. They marched, wrote, published, spoke, lobbied, hosted banquets, and worked the streets. In the process, they helped convince politicians, a dismissive public, and a largely hostile press to support what even the women themselves called their despised cause. When else, before or since, have so many of America's best-known male figures organized to get into the thick of it all and take direction from women leaders in support of a perceived women's cause? These largely forgotten suffragettes turn out to be true exemplars of how allies of any cause might act in the service of effecting real social change. The Suffragettes, How Women Used Men to Get the Vote, from Brooke Kroeger for Excelsior Editions, marching into 17.
I wanted to go down. So here are some of the arguments by profession. Attorneys and jurists. Just some of the names: Samuel Untermeyer, Gilbert Rowe, Supreme Court Justice David Brewer, and a bunch of assistant district attorneys across New York. Here was Rowe's argument. I don't know how to make that thing go away. Okay. Oh, okay. This is a booklet that was produced from a speech he had given at a men's league meeting. 15 ways that the laws discriminated. This is the most important, where the training and education and bent of mind of the judge unconsciously leads to discrimination. Alice Paul's group gathered in Washington to work on the federal amendment and staged protests outside the White House. Got arrested, jailed, staged hunger strikes, and were saved by Dudley Field Malone and George Gordon Battle, 2 attorneys. Malone was one of Wilson's top patronage posts, resigned it in protest till he came around on suffrage. Aiken in 1907 wrote this piece in North American Review that really brought to the fore what was happening in the British movement that was ahead of ours. Rabbi Wise was one of the founders of the League, and among many, many things he did, he got resolutions through. This is he speaking in 1918.
The shortest way we will not take is to continue to deny them the right and the duty of answering.
Shout, shout, up with your song, cry with the wind, for the dawn is breaking.
All of these men represented major publications, either as writers or the Lard was editor and publisher of The Post and The Nation. That's an interesting combination, and really was the League's first inspiration. Creel went from being head of publicity for the League to being Wilson's chief of propaganda for World War I, like a day apart. This was the letterhead. This was a fantastic project, the suffrage number of Puck, which assembled this extraordinary group of writers, and the editorial direction, all those men, Hapgood, Brisbane, Munsey, etc., very important names of the day, were all League people. Du Bois was not a member of the League, but certainly a fellow traveler, consistently pro-suffrage for the two reasons given, that a black person could not oppose enfranchisement of another citizen, and because it would increase the black vote. He ran 3 different suffrage issues over the critical period. I love this one. This is a great episode. W.L. George, a British scientist, starts this great "What is feminism?" debate by publishing an article saying what the feminists really wanted, which was all-out war, and would not hesitate to declare it. The article was so important that the Times Sunday magazine republished it just about a week or so later. Then came an avalanche of responses, pro and con, both from scientists and social scientists responding to the question. And here come the scientific arguments. All these men were League members. And then the men staged just across the street at Cooper Union a huge symposium at which many writers spoke. It's important to think about the men who were the husbands, sons, lovers, brothers of suffragists and were inspired by them and helped to underwrite the movement. George Foster Peabody, that's a name we still know at least. That's it. Thanks, everybody. Who's next? Christoph.
I'm not a Mac user, so to just get, yeah, okay. This one, here, from start, here, yeah, okay. There we go. And I just started. All right. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. Thank you so much to the New York Center for the Humanities, and especially Brooke. Brooke and I met when she was working on the papers of Eastman at the Lilly Library, and I'm so grateful that she invited me. I'm grateful to Gwyneth as well for organizing this, and especially to Adrian for making this thing work, which it didn't at first. So. And let's hope it works now. So I have a very small subsection of the story to tell. I wrote a biography of Max Eastman, and one of the delights of working on Eastman was that some of the papers of Eastman that are now at the Lilly were personally gathered by me and actually hand carried to the Lilly Library. I went out to his house on the Vineyard and spent days working there, gathering things, and I want to show you some of the material. One of the great things about working on this biography were the photographs, especially. So I'll show you some of the images of the women who made Eastman who he was, and why, in fact, he ended up supporting, co-founding the Men's League for Women's Suffrage. And I'll begin by showing you a brief clip that one of my former students actually did for the book. Let's see.
No one embodied radical America more glamorously than the writer Max Eastman. He was at the center of the hottest debates of the 20th century about women's rights, labor laws, and world peace. Eastman knew everyone
Chapman.
and had numerous friends, including Charlie Chapman, Isadora Duncan, and Leon Trotsky. One of his most talked about affairs was with the charismatic Hollywood actress Florence Deschamps. Famously handsome, he captivated men and women alike. Eastman was tried twice for treason and escaped to the Soviet Union. After his return, he translated Trotsky, wrote poetry, and hosted a successful radio quiz show. He blazed a trail for nudists everywhere by lounging naked on the benches of Martha's Vineyard.
I didn't do that. That was her idea.
Eastman ended up working for Reader's Digest. But he was never comfortable among conservatives either. He was, he said, still hoping for a sweetly reasonable world. His unconventional life, a story very much of interest today, is now retold in this definitive biography by Christoph Irmscher. Max Eastman, A Life. Available from Yale University Press and bookstores in June.
Thank you. So Eastman was born in 1883. He grew up in Elmira, New York. The Eastman children, and it's very important to mention his sister, Crystal Eastman, co-founder of what later on became the ACLU, who became sort of a personal hero of mine as I was working on this project. So it was Crystal. There was also an older brother, Anstis, who was a doctor. And sort of Eastman's rebelliousness was fostered in that circle in Elmira, which included Thomas Beecher of the Park Church. His parents were associate ministers there. His mother, in fact, was one of the first ordained female Congregationalist ministers and a feminist, and Mark Twain was part of that circle as well. Eastman's father gave a eulogy at Twain's funeral. The lady on the left is Mrs. Julia Beecher. She was Olivia Langdon Twain's Sunday school teacher, and she was an early influence on Mark Twain, inventor of the Beecher baby doll. She made about 1,000 of these dolls that actually the profits went to the Park Church. Eastman mentions, and he remembered her fondly, the indiscriminate fury, as he called it, that she brought to all her daily tasks, including the reading of Walt Whitman. This was one of the earliest influences on him, and he remembers how with an expression of grim yet joyful determination, she would read Walt Whitman's celebration of homosexual love and the Columnist poems, which was not what other people in Elmira did at the time. Woman in the middle is Eastman's mother, the Reverend Annis Eastman, who was another absolutely fascinating female presence in Eastman's life. She described herself while preaching as a racehorse eager to let go. That probably gives you a sense of what her preaching was like. There she is again in Glenora, New York, where they spent their summers. And the other part of the Eastman story, of the path to feminism, which for him was never something he wore in his sleeve. He was never sort of the kind of guy who would go to women and say, "Trust me, I'm an ally." It was more sort of a quiet kind of determination at first. Crystal is absolutely central to the story. There she is in her dorm room at Vassar. Lawyer, activist, wrote the first version on behalf of a workers' compensation law. And just a tremendous presence in Eastman's life. As I already said, the Eastmans spent summers in Glenora, which was essentially sort of an alternative commune that they were part of, where they discovered the delights of swimming naked and of diving especially. This is a picture of Eastman and Ruth Pickering and an unidentified person experimenting with what they call the double breakneck, which was a jump they copied from another heroine of theirs, Annette Kellerman, an Australian swimmer, who was just a tremendous presence as well, and later on became a guest in their Greenwich Village apartment. In New York, he lived with Crystal. He shared an apartment with Crystal Eastman in a very unconventional domestic arrangement. And there's a poem from that period that I just want to read a few lines from, in which he identifies himself for the first time as a male suffragette. And the lines that I want to read are, "I'd rather be a poulet, a chicken, to eternity and die in lonesome liberty without begetting than lose my own identity for the self of sitting on a nest of breeding." So a rejection of domesticity. He's a poulet, he's a male hencock. He used that term as well. Inspired by his mother's preaching and activism, he became, and that story is told in Brooke's book, a co-founder, member of the New York Men's League for Women's Suffrage. And the recipe for those speeches, which we have in manuscript, is quite easy. So he didn't go to these events for which he got paid, insisting that he had new things to say. He kept reiterating that it was important just to say them. And there's a quote from one of the first speeches he gave: "The fundamental, first and forcible and eternal way to get an opinion into a man's head and keep it there is to say it to him often and loud." And he also always insisted on making an important connection between workers' rights and women's rights. And he explained, and these are words that remain important to me, that he would also in his classes at Columbia, where he was teaching philosophy, he would talk about suffragism. They think, he said, I'm queer to introduce such a matter into the classroom to begin with. And they think I'm queerer still to lecture them on the result, but I do it anyway. It was logical in a sense that the path he had been traveling, and I'm only talking about a small section of it, would lead him to his brilliant first wife, Ida Rao, a sculptor, lawyer, activist, Margaret Sanger associate, who in her studio at 5 West 16th Street would sculpt models that would pose for her in the nude, and it was important enough for the Times to report on that, and would publicly distribute birth control pamphlets in Union Square, right under the nose of 50 policemen. Thank you.
I have no pictures whatsoever, I'm sorry. You just imagine everything I'm saying. Look at that lovely lady the whole time. I'm so happy to be here to celebrate Brooke's amazing book. I didn't know any of this stuff, and it was wonderful, and I can't wait to start stealing this information and making use of it myself. The only sort of non-heroic male figure, I think, practically, except for Woodrow Wilson was sort of a weenie in the whole thing, but really non-heroic, was the editorial page of the New York Times. It was just horrible. And when I wrote my book, I went back and I read their opinions on suffrage. They were written by a guy named Charles Ransom Miller, and it was all stuff like, some people will say that all Americans deserve the right to vote. Well, children don't deserve the right to vote, so why women? It was just awful stuff. And when I became the editorial page editor, I had this big room that you could have meetings in, and on the one wall was a portrait of Charles Ransom Miller, who had been the editorial page editor for like 45 years, and all during the entire suffrage period. So every once in a while, when there was nobody around, I would just go in and go up to him and say, I got your job. And that's But I wanted to say just a couple of words about some of the other men who came kind of after Brooke's men. When, for instance, when finally suffrage was voted out, the constitutional amendment was voted out in Congress, there were all of these stories about guys who were being brought in on stretchers and I had no idea there were so many disabled representatives in my life, but one guy had broken his shoulder and his arm, and he wouldn't let them set them because he thought he might not be there in time for the vote. And they all came to support suffrage. And then, of course, the amendment went out to the states to be ratified. And as any of you who sort of watched the story of the Equal Rights Amendment will get the sense right away. You know, it went really well for a while. It was great. It just zooped through the first states, and then it slowed down and it slowed down. And they just needed one more state, and Tennessee was still in session. Everybody else had gone home for the summer. Everybody went down to Tennessee, and everybody knew it was very, very close. The liquor lobby went down there because they knew if women got the right to vote, they would vote in prohibition. So they were giving out free liquor all over the place. Everybody was drunk. They got through the Senate, the ratification passed very well in the Senate. They got to the House. Everybody knew it was absolutely down the middle. And then the Speaker of the House gets up and changes his vote and announces he's voting no. And you can imagine, Carrie, Chapman, Catt, all these people are there just seeing their lives go down the drain. And this young guy, 24 years old, the youngest member of the House, gets up. His name is Harry Byrne. He's from the east side of Tennessee. And he says, Mr. Speaker, I have a letter from my mother. They thought he was a no vote. And he says, my mother says, don't forget to go and vote for suffrage. A good boy always does what his mother says. I vote yes. And that was the vote. And that's how, in a way, women got the right to vote. All this amazing story that Brooke told ends up with Harry Burns jumping up and saying, Mom told me to vote for suffrage, and there I go. And that's my story for today. I think we're going to sit right down now and talk about Brooke's story, Christoph's story, and you guys can then ask questions. Okay, we all need our microphones. Oh, I'm sorry, we need it for the taping, so here we are. Microphones are on. Are they on? Are they on? Are they all on? We're all happy?
Yeah.
Okay. I wanted to read one more little thing. This is Carrie Chapman, Catt, who, when you read Brooke's story, you will read a lot about, was the leader of the suffrage movement, really. And she said at the end, in order to get the word male out of the Constitution, in effect, it took 52 years of pauseless campaign, 56 campaigns of referenda, 480 campaigns to get legislatures to submit suffrage amendments to the voters, 47 campaigns to get constitutional conventions to change state conventions, 277 campaigns to get state party conventions to include suffrage planks, 30 campaigns to get presidential party conventions to include suffrage planks, and 19 campaigns with 19 successive Congresses, plus that 18,000-foot petition that Brooke writes about that was delivered to Congress. And my question about, I mean, it sounds wonderful in a way, but it sounds awful in a way too. It's just like nobody would want to sign up for that. Oh my God in heaven. And somehow, about the time that men entered this thing, it became cool. There were parades, they were having demonstrations, they were having floats and banners and ads for butter and margarine and stuff with women on them. And what's the story here? Is there a connection?
Well, the connection is that Harriet Stanton Blatch came back from Britain and had a lot of new ideas about how to juice the movement.
This is Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter.
Correct. Mm-hmm. And one of the things she thought was very important for a group that didn't have the vote was to attract attention, and that one of the things you could do was marching bands, people, and demonstrating that you had a sense of form and color. And you see how important that even becomes in 1917 when we are at war. So suddenly we're not going to do purple and gold and green. We move to somber colors and achieve the same effect in a more somber time.
But somehow, people like Max Eastman, when they came in, made this thing really cool. Was it them making it cool, or was it becoming cool all by itself? And then Max Eastman, he was a really cool guy.
He was. At some point, as you probably gathered from the video, he stopped being cool for some people. And he changed his political opinions rather drastically. Yeah. Interesting enough, he never, there were a couple of things he didn't let go of. Communism, sure. Women's rights, reproductive rights especially, remained important to him. He didn't waver on that, and atheism. That's the other thing that made him a kind of an uncomfortable presence for the guys at National Review, for example, which he finally had to quit. But he was very. Even at the time, he didn't just have admirers, he was a very charismatic presence, and that, of course, lent some credibility to the entire movement. I wish I could say that he sort of embraced it and it came out of the blue. What I kind of wanted to show is that essentially his mother was the commanding presence behind it, and she was Anisford Eastman, and she was really cool in her own right. I mean, this was somebody who never stopped learning, never stopped. She would take classes, summer classes at Harvard. She wrote letters to her son in which she basically outlined for him what he had to, and Brooke read many of those, what he had to believe and what he had to do. And she started doing this when he was at Williams College, essentially sort of prescribing things that he should read and so forth. So in a sense, he was groomed to be cool. And the Eastman children, certainly, Anstis was the older brother. He was kind of left out of the whole equation. He was a brute, as people referred to him. But Crystal was definitely the other influence on him. She was older. She She was extremely well read, and she had very unconventional sort of views about relationships with men and so forth. And that, in a way, shaped him more than anything else. So by the time he finally got to it, he was a product of where he came from, and he was eternally grateful for that, revisiting this even late in his life.
But I had the sense that, well, he came to the movement because he needed money. He was Dewey's protege in philosophy at Columbia. He, had a university stipend. Money was clearly an issue, and he claimed, though I never found the article in the Herald that he said where he had said.
I didn't either.
I didn't
No.
find, and I looked hard, as my students know. I look hard for things. I did not find it. But he claimed that he had also had the idea at the same time that Villard did. It really was Villard who was the impetus for the movement, because he went to Anna Shaw, suggested it. She, of course, you'll love this, offered to do all the work, behind the scenes. But to Villard's enormous credit, he said no, that the organization would be stronger and more important if the men organized independently.
Wasn't there a thing, though, that was it Eastman who kept saying you don't have to go to any meetings?
Oh, yeah.
Join my group, there will never be a meeting?
Right, but then they were meeting immediately, which was great.
Okay, well,
But yeah, they said, all we want is your name, your dollar in dues, and you'll never have to go to a meeting. That was the big sell, but it was not true.
Did they mostly have mothers or sisters that got them in, or was
Totally.
Okay.
Wives, mothers, sisters, lovers, in almost every case. And then there's a whole slew of bachelors who came through their mothers.
But none of these guys seem to think this was a central point in their lives. At least it wasn't in their obituaries or their biographies.
No, I think, this is what gave me the idea that they really were the consummate allies, because they never talked about it afterwards. I mean, Eastman does in his biography, but of course he was the secretary. And he was wholesaling work he'd already done. He was putting that 1913 article right back in, almost word for word.
Yeah.
So it was material he
Always
had to fill out his
reused,
book.
it's very important.
Yeah, exactly. It was reappropriating the work. But others would mention that they had an interest in suffrage and other progressive causes. Remember, everyone was a progressive, even if they were Democrats or Republicans or independents or socialists. They had progressive ideas. And it was exciting to me to see in Mike Wallace's new Greater Gotham, just such an exciting book, such a short period of time and 1,000 pages to talk about the consolidation of New York and the conglomeration and the ending of competitions and things that got in the way of this becoming the imperial city. And my guys are straight through those years. I mean, they're all very prominent. Frank Vanderlip was the head of what is now Citibank. James Lee's Laidlaw owned one of the investment boutiques. I mean, they were major figures. And that, to me, is what we don't quite see, even when men come forward. Like, is the president of Citibank now, involved in equal pay for equal work or against assault? Or, I mean, like, we don't really see those kinds of visionaries who were at the forefront of the creation of the city and the making of the new world, really, who also would embrace a cause that was so despised. I mean, it's sort of extraordinary.
And you had nothing to win then. At least half of the Citibank customers are women now, and they're voting for people too and stuff like that.
Well,
But
then,
that
as
was
you
just
could
sort
see,
of-
women couldn't even hold on to their own money, so there was that.
Now, Alice Paul shows up a lot in the book, and basically it's a fight between the people who want to be well behaved and Alice Paul who wants to drive everybody as crazy as humanly possible. And Alice Paul really won, right? I mean, in the long, no?
I think, I think in any social movement, you're going to have agitators, you're going to have people working behind the scenes quietly in a conciliatory way, and then you're going to have forces that are beyond anybody's control, like war. So,
And if they hadn't been there getting arrested and starving themselves in jail and stuff, do you think it still would have all happened, but maybe...
Who knows? I mean, it's hard to say, because at the same time, New York votes. That brings 44 seats that are pro-suffrage into Congress. 5 other states pass it at the same time. So then there's critical mass in Congress of people who would support, which helps Wilson to counter the South that is against it, because, of course, it's going to increase the black vote. So he then has cover. And the war happens, and women are making these extraordinary sacrifices, both in their families and in their actions, that it becomes harder and harder to say no, which is also what happened in Britain. So there was a confluence of factors, all of which, and then those agitators on the lawn who Wilson thought were totally obnoxious.
Yeah.
Well.
One thing, perhaps, too, is that when Eastman is becoming committed to the cause, one important thing is that as an editor of the masses, he's really featuring women's work and the work of women artists, and that's an extraordinary step. Putting them. I don't have a copy of the masses, but I do have a copy of the Liberator here, which I just picked out. It's a little too late because it's 1919, but that's the work of Cornelia Barnes, and showing women on strike. So it's an amazing image, and so these women get represented as co-authors of really important statements, and the masses especially become sort of a central organ for not in a direct political sense, but certainly in an aesthetic sense, for making women part of the conversation. I wish I could show you the masses, but they're very expensive, these things, and even I couldn't afford them.
If you go to modjourn.org, you can find all of them.
Yeah.
And they're beautifully
But it's not
reproduced.
like holding them in your hand,
I know,
right?
but it's close.
Yeah.
You've got a quote in the book from Eastman saying that he thought that Britain gave women the vote earlier because there were more women than men in Britain.
Yeah.
But in the United States, the places that started first to give women the right to vote were all places where there were no women, and they were thinking, I think, maybe if we have given them the right to vote, they'll come and marry us and stuff. Am I wrong? Or he did think that, right?
Yeah.
Is it possible he was wrong? Is that
Always.
I asked this question this weekend of someone who was an expert in the suffrage in the West, and there isn't really an answer. I mean, part of it is there were few women, of course. They also didn't have as many protocols as we do. They were not as established. They were a little more willing to experiment. So it kind of makes sense that the Western states would be first. New York was the first east of the Missouri, and then sort of broke the East Coast hex. And then we got this momentum for support, and then it all happened pretty quickly thereafter. Of course, 2.5 more years, but still, that's relatively quickly.
And you didn't have that kind of comfortable feeling that, well, we'll let all 6 of the women in our state vote.
Exactly.
They can do whatever the heck they want after that.
Exactly.
Who's your favorite person in your book?
Laidlaw is my favorite.
Say a little more about it.
So he was the husband of Harriet Burton Laidlaw, who was a very important New York suffragist. They had a home in New York City and a home on Sands Point, Long Island, from which they managed a lot of activities. He would go with her on suffrage, auto trips through New York to rally support, out to Montana and to California. And he was the head of an investment bank. Very wealthy, someone who could trace his lineage back through 50 different lines to colonial days. And his statements, I'm passing out the Men's League mission statement, which is very emblematic of the way he thought about things. And also his tombstone, which I didn't bring with me, but it's worth looking up on Find a Grave to see what he had inscribed. So I liked him a lot.
Go on. Do you know what?
I can't summon it, but anyway, it was pretty cool. He just impressed me because of the way he was a helpmate, and then of course, never talked about it again. She resurrected him. Like his name actually appears on the plaque in Albany, a bronze plaque at the State House, to the great women of suffrage, and there's one man's name there, his, and I think she probably was responsible for that because it was struck the year after he died, and he truly deserved it. What I loved about him is that when the vote was won, and at Cooper Union they have this great big meeting and celebration, and of course he's honored because he's done, incredible work to help this happen quietly. And he says thank you, and he immediately says, of course, the women did it. The women did everything. And he said, we men, this is an investment banker, we men learned something too. We learned to be auxiliaries. It's just so extraordinary.
Okay, that is very, very cool.
Yeah, I like him. I like him a lot. I like Eastman too.
Do you have any favorite women from your book?
It's probably Crystal Eastman, who really, I should have mentioned that she is very likely the first female car sales person in the U.S. Because that's what she did for a brief period of time.
Wow.
There was somebody who constantly reinvented herself and really got a bad deal eventually because no one would hire her. Spending the 1920s just in abject poverty, dying in 1928 of an undiagnosed kidney ailment, and just vanished. And she's somebody who's really worth resurrecting. Terrific writer, very funny, very strange, I mean, which I love about her. The letters that she and Eastman exchanged when he was at Williamson, she was at Vassar, are quite extraordinary because they missed each other, and she would essentially look at the female students at Vassar and single out likely girlfriends for Max, sort of posing as Max, and he in turn would, respond with sort of similar things, and they kept this dialogue going, which is like nothing I've ever seen being exchanged between, siblings at least. But you realize that they were extraordinary people. But she, to me, is the one that's just extraordinary. She wrote a book about essentially workers' compensation law, which is, believe it or not, fascinating to read. Brilliant stories that she collected from actually going out, investigating mine accidents and other things, and really trying to find ways of getting these guys compensated for what was happening to them. And there's again this combination of workers' rights, women's rights, and so forth that gets implanted in Eastman. Yeah.
Talk about his relationship with Inez Milholland.
Well, that was a very strange one as well.
Semi-naked lady on the horse, right?
Yeah. She was, Eastman adored her, and she was, for him, kind of a, disaster in many ways, because he was not the kind of man she wanted, and she made that very clear to him, that he wasn't up to her standards. She was involved in his lecturing. She would drive him, in fact, to lectures that he would give, but he was ultimately fell short of of her expectations. It might have been a problem that he would regularly report on their relationship to his mother, who was part of that kind of strange menage from the beginning.
Well, Inez Milholland was part of your thing about the parades. This is a really beautiful woman who always rode these horses at the front of the parade.
She was always at the front of the parade, and she's considered now the suffrage martyr. She died in her early 30s of a pernicious anemia, I think.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I think so. And was very close to Max in those early days while the League was getting formed. And both Inez and Crystal were NYU law students. There's even an Inez Milholland chair at NYU Law, I learned recently.
Was Inez the one who objected to the idea of women and children first on the Titanic? Was that?
I
I love that factoid, just the idea that the suffragists were very upset about women and children first. They said, just be children first.
Well, because the disproportionate number of men who died made that really real, and that was a rule of the sea. And they opposed it, because it happened. They were grateful for it, but obviously opposed it because it didn't fit with suffragist view. It should have been children first and men and women making that happen.
Although if you were on the Titanic.
Yeah, maybe you would have felt a little differently. Could be.
We have a park in my neighborhood for Ida Strauss and her husband, who were the Macy's founder. They were both on the Titanic, and she would not go. She stayed with her husband, and she got a park out of it. But still,
go, Mrs. Strauss.
I guess we should start with questions, right? You must have. Go right ahead.
Is there anything you could add about the relationship between this movement and the war? I'm not thinking of this astrology here, but to the extent. All right, again. Is there anything you can add about the First World War in relation to the suffrage movement. I'm thinking especially because you mentioned the population in Britain was diminished, 20 million or whatever died, men, and that might or might not have been comparable in this country, or is there any connection at all?
I'm not sure I understand the
All right.
question.
Well, insofar as the American participation in the First World War ended in November of 1918, and this movement was underway, is there any connection between the role that women took in relation to the war and...
Definitely.
All right, well,
So
that's-
as soon as we enter the war, the women of New York immediately agreed to go do a census of every man in the state who's eligible to be drafted. They changed their parades in those last years to be about preparedness and then to celebrate patriotism. So they changed the whole focus. They become the National Women's Party. They do a lot of things to diminish the suffrage question because it would only get opposition. People saying, why are you talking about that when, you know, we're in crisis? So that was definitely so. And as we were saying before, it certainly played a role in the change in view at the federal level to allow the amendment to pass for the first time in 70 years.
And there wasn't much pacifism in the suffrage movement, right, when the war came?
It was sort of, it wasn't an issue, though. You know, Max was a big disarmament guy. He was against it.
He was on the lecture circuit as an anti-war speaker. Pacifist is probably not the right word for it because he was not a pacifist in the strict sense, but he certainly was against American entry in the war. He changed his mind only very, very late, you know, probably under the impact of the Bolsheviks, where he felt that this was legitimized somehow limited engagement in the war. But his lecturing on behalf of women's rights sort of transitioned into anti-war speeches that he gave all over the country, traveling often at great personal risk. And his letters talk about it, how he was threatened and with necktie parties where they essentially, you know, promised they would hang him somewhere on the outskirts of town in South Dakota or places where he went. But that was certainly part and parcel of the picture. And Crystal was, in fact, again here the person who led the way in her anti-war engagement. So again, he was following his
Why do you
sister,
think
actually.
Wilson liked him so much? I mean, even when he was opposing him at a certain point, he still seemed to have a deference to Max. What was that
because
about?
They met at that banquet and,
In Syracuse?
yeah, and he liked him as a speaker, and there was certain
Intellectual
certain
affinity?
intellectual frisson or something like that between the two.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Woodrow Wilson was a very irritating person. wasn't
Totally
he?
irritating. But so was Teddy Roosevelt. I mean, they were louses, and they really were. They were, on this subject, they just would not come around until it was politically expedient.
Thank you all for being here. I'm curious what you've learned from your research as we think about advancing feminism moving forward and the critical role that male allies play in that fight. I think there are some key differences. That winning suffrage was very straightforward. It was
Exactly.
something we need to change, whereas now I think a lot of advancing feminism is about cultural changes that are a little bit harder to name. But I'm wondering what you've learned that we might think about as we engage male allies in the next steps of this fight.
That's a great question. I tried to analyze why this worked, why men were able to get behind it in this very focused, directed way, and in part it's because it was a very clear issue and a very clear social wrong. It just, it suddenly, as the arguments came to the fore, as you saw the ones I flashed, it just made less and less sense to hold to something that no longer should be that way. And then if you think of the issues today, none of them is quite that clear cut, I guess. I mean, we'd like to think they were, but I think, when you say equal pay for equal work, what is equal if you have to take time for, you can see why everything gets more complicated. I was trying to think, what issue do we have today? Maybe somebody in the audience would have a sense of that would be clear-cut enough that people could simply get behind it and help make it happen from whatever vantage point they were standing. In this case, men controlled all the avenues of power and influence. So things that were very hard for women who were non-voters were very simple for them. And even though the important women in the movement could get an appointment with President Wilson or with President Roosevelt, they were able to, or Taft even, they were able to do that. They even got Taft to come give a speech that was actually didn't turn out so well, but at least they could get acknowledgement, but they couldn't go play golf. You know, they just couldn't have that access that would make things very simple for a man. And so it's hard to draw those parallels. I think, you know, the only organization we see today that is somewhat comparable is the UN's He for She. Are you familiar with that? But it's in UN Women, founded by women. There are men on the board. I mean, there are men involved, obviously. But Emma Watson was the spokesman for 3 years. It was sort of, where are the guys? Even though there are a lot of men involved at the next level, you know, forming goals for their organizations. And I think they've done some terrific work. But you feel that the impetus is female. In this case, these men were signing their own receipts. You know, their own $1 membership receipts are being signed by Ward Melville, who's the founder of, you know, Stony Brook University. You know, just a very different thing. Not celebrity endorsement.
Is part of what you're saying maybe that, and perhaps this is a lesson for other civil rights movements as well? Thank you. I wonder if part of what you're saying is that one of the important ways to engage allies is to make issues much more straightforward, because perhaps nuance is more challenging for allies to grasp?
Maybe. I don't know. Someone should speak to that.
Any allies?
I can. You asked about what I personally took from that, and I guess, and I tried to mention this in these brief remarks. If you engage in a cause where you're an ally, don't try to set the tone, but follow the lead of those that are most affected by it. And regardless of what Eastman did later, a lot of which I do not admire, I admire that part of his engagement, that it was very clear, yes, he was making money, yes, it was something that allowed him to sort of bathe in the admiration of these women, but he was very clear in all his speeches that he was not the one defining the terms of the debate, that he was following the lead of the women who were affected. And this was wisdom that was decades, centuries old even, and he was just stepping in and being a kind of coach or somebody who was repeating the terms of a debate that he had not set. And that I find very touching, and it's sort of in a way, a recipe for that type of political engagement. You know, when you think about mansplaining and so forth, and those types of things, that is a way that you can engage without making yourself a central part of the cause.
We have learned to be auxiliaries. I mean, it was such an extraordinary statement. I think that they're a consummate model for allyship. I mean, or however you want to talk about that. They really, for whatever reason, seem to absolutely do everything in the way that it should be done. There's one point where Max suggests in Albany they're trying to cultivate the legislature, and he says, you should not have all these women on the stage. Men will listen to men. This should be all men up here. And the women oppose it. He's the only man there, and he, you know, continues on. Whereas some of the women who came to the fore in this period, we have a whole gilded group of society ladies who also are a parallel prong of the same strategy in this last 10 years and brought, you know, kind of a dazzling gloss to the movement that had been seen as very dowdy. But when they get mad, they leave. You know, there's a whole different thing. When their ideas aren't taken, they pack up ship. Anybody else?
Was there any similar movement like this surrounding the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA?
Gail can answer that one. Sorry.
Was there any similar groundswell of the men's movement of any sort surrounding the ERA?
When it started, when the ERA came up in its final incarnation, there was this general expectation that this thing was going to just kind of fly along through. And I mean, it wasn't hard to be a male supporter. Everybody was sort of a supporter. And then you had this pushback from what's really now the cultural right, talking about housewives being demeaned, and maybe, you know, wives will lose, you know, their financial protections, and it just blossomed and blossomed and blossomed. And you still had all the same men kind of, you know, it was really a woman's argument at that point in time. And so I don't see men as playing a central point, but maybe, Brooke, that's your next book, and you can just check this out. Go ahead.
Hi, I was just wondering if you guys knew anything about the role of, everyone you've talked about has been white and mostly middle and upper class, so I was wondering if you guys had any insight into the role of men and women of color, sort of lower class people, more marginalized groups in the suffragists.
You know, that's a really good question, and I want to add a little bit to it because I thought about that before. W.E.B. Du Bois.
Well, I did a whole lot with him.
Christmas.
He did a lot.
He's in there a lot, but
he did a lot.
He was betrayed by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony after the blacks got the right to vote, at least theoretically, and women didn't, and they were so angry and awful and racist and terrible, but he stepped beyond it and moved
because
right.
he understood that you could not, as a once disenfranchised people, stand for the disenfranchisement of another citizen. It was very clear. And strategically, he understood, as I said before, that it would increase the black vote, so of course he was pro. Even though he hated Villard, and all of them, Dewey, Wise, Villard, Du Bois, all were founders of the NAACP with, of course, so many others, but they were all part of that original coterie. And it was a more important issue, I have to say, to the men in the League. African American rights and development was far more important to almost all of them than, you just don't even see it in their private papers, but the other issues they really go to bat for, because they cared.
Anybody else?
Could wrap it up.
Way far? I think we can wrap it up then and move on to conversation and waters and other things that we have over there. Thank you guys so much.
Thank
Brooke,
you.
congratulations.
Humanities Institute.
Christoph, thank you for
NYU Journalism.